Today we're painting this Ogre Guard from Reaper Bones. As you can see, I've done a zenithal highlight. This is with spray cans, I don't have an airbrush, and I've decided to keep the hand and club separate so that I can paint the shoulders and stuff just a little bit easier. I've always liked the zenithal highlight because, well, it kind of looks cool. You see all of the details just from the priming part of it, but then I've always gone over it with a full base coat and it's made very little difference. Here I'm trying a different thing where I'm going to, I guess, paint by numbers. So everywhere that's very dark is going to become my shadow. For the colour scheme, I've kind of gone the opposite of what happens a lot, and I'm going for warm shadows and then cold highlights. So I'm painting with this orange, which is probably a little bit too bright, but I'm going to see how it goes. And I'm putting that just where we have black or very dark areas. So this is our shadow colour. This is where the paint by number comes in. I don't really have to think too much about where the highlights and stuff should be. That's something that will come later. Right now, I'm literally just painting over the bits that are dark. Now I'm going to take a dark green, and placing this down, you can see it doesn't come out that dark. That's where the zenithal part you should come in when you just base coat over the whole thing, because it will be a lighter colour over a lighter undertone. That means I'll just have to do a couple of layers, but essentially what we're doing here again is paint by numbers, and I'm painting all of the bits that are grey. So they're not very dark, they've already been filled with orange, and they're not white, that's going to be filled in with a highlight colour. We're just going in the areas that are grey, which is mostly next to all of our orange. And this is what it looks like when we get to that point. It actually looks kind of cool like this, but there's a bigger difference than there needs to be. And that can be resolved by just going over it a few more layers. And so when we go over a few more layers, this is what we get. So now we have the orange in the shadows and up to this dark green in, I guess, the mid-tones. And that leaves us just the white areas that we want to highlight. As I said, I wanted to do that with a cold green, so I'm just going to add some light blue to it. This is the lightest blue I have. Placing this down, I quite like the colour and the tone, but you can see it's about as bright as the green next to it. So we're not actually highlighting, we're just using a different colour. So I need to add something lighter. I've decided that I will add white. Because I'm going for a cold tone, I don't necessarily have to worry too much about losing the saturation. What we're going to get is this desaturated, slightly colder tone, which kind of works for the scheme that I was going for anyway. And you guessed it, paint by numbers, we are just going to paint this in the areas that are left, essentially. So the bits that were white when I did the zenithal highlight. It's worth noting that, just like with the dark green, this is a thinned down kind of version, which means I can start the blending process straight away. So I'm going from that darker mid-tone green that we have up to this, and we're painting on top of white instead of the green. So we can kind of glaze over the whole thing from the green into the areas that we want this paint to sit, and that will give us a blend from the very beginning. The face should probably have had more of this paint, but I've always done the face somewhat separately, so that's why I'm kind of ignoring it. Once you get to this stage, you've kind of done the fundamentals. This is where you would have been if you just did the base coat. Essentially, everything just has its base coat, but we've done it in a paint by numbers system, so we already have a fair amount of contrast. But what we can do now is we can highlight out the details that we want to use, and we can define our light source a little bit more. So what I'm doing is glazing in with the shadow colour, that orange, so that will bring everything down or closer to the orange and down in terms of brightness. And if I consider the body a large cylinder, I want the centre part of that to be the brightest. So I put the shadows out to the edges, that will leave the middle nice and bright. And that will define the overall shape. Once I get happy with the skin and the skin tones, it's time to paint everything else. This is mostly going to be browns. What I'm going to do here is kind of base coat everything in one or two browns, and that's all going to come from a single brown, this source here. For highlights and shadows, I'm just going to consider cold and warm. So I'm either going to add some blue to it, or I'm going to add some of this kind of very warm light brown to it. And that should give me enough colour range and contrast range to define things like the belt and the furs and the ropes and things like that from one another. And so this is what it looks like. As you can see, it's mostly the same brown. I've used kind of a warmer brown for the belt, but everything else is the same. And then we define it and make it different deciding on what we're going to highlight or shade, or whether we're going to make it warm or going to make it cold, and we do that in a contrasting way so that each thing stands out. I did that and decided I wanted to push it a little bit further with the furs. There's a fair amount of textured detail on the miniature, and rather than go in and paint all the details, so I'm going to just wash into the furs, and I'm going to do that in a few stages, going lower and lower, so that it gets darker the further down the furs go. As for the weapon, I'm going to do the same thing. Again, I'm going to consider it a cylinder, so I'm going to paint light brown on the top, a dark cold brown on the bottom. That's going to give us a fairly well-defined cylinder shape. And so this is what the finished result looks like. So we do have a kind of colder highlight, we have a very warm shadow, and I quite like the skin effect. This figure is mostly skin, and this is what I wanted to focus on this miniature, and I think it looks pretty cool. It almost has kind of an OSL campfire underneath it effect. Perhaps they should have been darker to avoid it looking like OSL. Regardless, I like the effect. We definitely have this range of being brighter at the top and darker at the bottom, so the overall kind of contrast works. We have pretty well defined shapes. Let me know what you think in the comments, and that's all I have for this video. See you in the next one. Bye!